The morning of my daughter's wedding, I stood in front of the mirror in my room at the Fairmont and told myself I would not cry. Not yet. Not until I had said what I needed to say. I had been waiting 22 years for that moment. The woman looking back at me was 63 years old, gray hair cut short the way I'd kept it since the chemo, crow's feet I'd stopped trying to hide somewhere around 55. I had pressed my own dress the night before because I didn't trust the hotel laundry with it. Powder blue. My daughter had picked it out. She said it made me look like someone's grandmother, and she meant that as a compliment. I held on to that. What I could not hold on to was the small white card tucked inside my purse, the one I had been carrying for 11 months. Let me go back. I grew up in Sudbury, nickel country. My father worked the mines and his father before him, and when I was young, I thought that was just what men did in our part of Ontario. They went underground, and they came back up, and on Sundays they smelled like engine grease no matter how long they showered. I left at 19 for nursing school in Ottawa, met my husband at a church fundraiser, married him at 24. He was an electrician. Steady work, steady man. We moved to a small town outside of Thunder Bay because his union got him placed there. And by the time our daughter was 2 years old, I had started to feel like I had built something real. His name was Gerald. I don't say that often anymore, but for this story, you need to know he existed and that he was good. He died in February, the year our daughter turned 3. There was a fire at a construction site, an industrial retrofit job, a warehouse outside the city they were converting to condos. The fire marshal's report said the electrical panel had been improperly installed, that a safety inspection had been skipped, that the subcontractor responsible for signing off on the work had falsified the records. That subcontractor's name was Robert Haynes. I know that name the way I know my own birthday. I have known it for 22 years. I wrote it in the back of a journal I kept the first year after Gerald died, when I was writing down everything I could think of because I was so afraid I would go numb and forget to be angry. I did not forget. The investigation went nowhere. Robert Haynes had a lawyer. He had connections at the municipal level. There was a settlement. I say that word loosely because what I received was $38,000 and a non-disclosure agreement that I signed because I had a 3-year-old, no income, and 2 months of groceries left. My mother-in-law sat at the kitchen table when I signed it and cried. She said Gerald would have understood. I said I hoped he wouldn't because I didn't. I took the money. I moved us back to Sudbury to be near my mother. I went back to work at the hospital as a registered nurse, and I worked every shift they gave me, and I raised my daughter. Her name is Claire. She is everything I am not. Outgoing, loud when she laughs, the kind of person who remembers every waiter's name and tips 25% even when the service is slow. She got Gerald's eyes and my stubbornness and somehow ended up a licensed civil engineer, which I will never stop finding remarkable given that I helped her with her grade 11 math homework by Googling the answers alongside her. She called me on a Tuesday in October 3 years ago and said, "Mom, I met someone." I said, "Tell me." She said his name was Owen, that he was kind, that he worked in commercial real estate in Toronto, that she had met him at a conference in Vancouver and they had talked for 4 hours over the hotel bar. And she had known, she said, she had just known. I said, "Bring him to Sudbury. I want to make him pierogies." She laughed. She said she would. It was 4 months later when she brought him home for the first time. He was tall, quiet in the way of men who are used to listening, and he helped me clear the table without being asked. I liked him immediately. I liked the way he looked at my daughter. I liked that when I showed him the photograph on the mantle, the one of Claire at her university convocation, gown and all, laughing so hard she's blurred. He picked it up and studied it like it was something worth studying. I did not meet his family that visit. He mentioned his father once, briefly, said he was in construction and development, that they had a complicated relationship, that it was a long story. I didn't push. Everyone has a long story. Claire and Owen got engaged the following spring. There was a small party at Owen's parents' house in Oakville, a house I had not been to before, a neighborhood I had only driven through. I arrived with a bottle of Ontario Riesling and a card, and I stood on the front step and rang the bell. The man who answered was Robert Haynes. I recognized him from the photo I had found in a newspaper archive 8 years earlier. A real estate development story, a ribbon cutting somewhere in Hamilton. He had aged. The hair was mostly white now, but the jaw was the same. I don't know how long I stood there. It could not have been more than 3 seconds. He did not recognize me. Why would he? I was no one to him. I was a name on a settlement agreement 2 decades old. I said, "I'm Claire's mother. Thank you for having me." He smiled and stepped aside. I sat through that party. I drank half a glass of wine. I watched my daughter laugh with the woman who would become her mother-in-law, a pleasant woman named Susan who kept refilling the cheese board and apologizing for the catering. Even though there was no catering, she had made everything herself. I watched Robert Haynes pour drinks and slap Owen on the shoulder and tell a story about a hockey game. I watched him be a person. I drove home in 4.5 hours and I did not turn on the radio. I did not tell Claire. I know what you're thinking. I know because I have thought it every single day since. She had a right to know. She was about to marry into that family. She deserved the truth. But I also knew my daughter. I knew that if I told her, she would feel that she had to choose. And I knew, not feared, knew that any choice I forced her to make would fracture something between us that I had spent 30 years building. I had watched other mothers do that. I had watched them turn their grief into leverage and lose their children over it. I was not going to do that. What I was going to do was figure out if there was another way. I called a lawyer the week I got back, a woman I had found through the Law Society of Ontario, someone who specialized in workplace negligence. I explained the situation. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then she said, "You signed an NDA." I said, "I know." She said, "There may be ways around it, depending on what he's done since." That was the beginning of 11 months of phone calls, document requests, and late nights at my kitchen table with a laptop and cold tea. What I found, what my lawyer found, was that Robert Haynes had not stopped. There were 2 other projects. One in the late 90s, a residential build in Barrie where a foundation inspection had been signed off by a company he controlled, and the inspection had never happened. No one had died, but the building had been condemned 6 years after construction. 15 families displaced, and there was a paper trail. If you knew how to look for it. The second thing she found was that the original NDA I had signed had a clause, standard in Ontario at the time, that explicitly did not prohibit disclosure in the context of legal proceedings or regulatory complaints. We had grounds. I filed a complaint with the Ontario College of Trades in March. I filed a supplementary statement with the Provincial Labour Board in May. My lawyer said it would be slow. She said it might go nowhere. She said I should be prepared for that. I said, "I've been prepared for things going nowhere for 22 years. She sent me a white card in June. It was a professional summary, a 1-page document outlining the regulatory actions that had been initiated, the reference numbers, the names of the investigators assigned, a paper trail with my name on it. I put it in my purse. I did not tell Claire. The wedding was September 14th. Claire had booked a venue outside of Barrie, a converted barn on a property overlooking the lake. The kind of place that takes your breath away on a clear day, and on that day the sky was the particular blue you only get in Ontario in September. The blue that makes you understand why people who leave always want to come back. I was not seated at the head table. I want to be honest about that. It had been discussed, and I had said it was fine. The table arrangement was a whole thing. There were logistics with Owen's extended family, and I said, genuinely, not martyr style, that I was fine at a table with Claire's friends from university. I know those women. I love those women. They had all brought me Tim's on the morning of the ceremony and made me cry in a good way. But I noticed at the reception when Robert Haynes stood up to speak before the best man, before me, before anyone. I noticed the way he commanded the room. He was practiced at it. He was the kind of man who had spent decades being the most important person in any space he entered. He spoke about Owen for 4 minutes and about his own business accomplishments for 3. He made a joke I didn't understand about a golf trip. Then he said, I am going to say this exactly right because I have replayed it in my head many times. He said, of course, we also want to recognize Claire's family. We understand she was raised in more modest circumstances, and we think it's wonderful that she has found her way to a better situation. He said that at a microphone, in front of 240 people. I heard it land at my table like something dropped from a height. I saw Claire's face across the room go very still. I saw Owen look at his father with an expression I will always be grateful for. It was not approval. I sat for exactly 5 seconds. I don't know who I was in those 5 seconds. I was a woman in a powder blue dress. I was a nurse who had worked night shifts with a 3-year-old at home. I was a widow who had signed a paper for $38,000 because she had no other choice. I was a mother who had kept a secret for 11 months to protect her daughter's right to choose her own life. And then I picked up my water glass and I stood up. The room had not gone quiet yet. There was still the ambient noise of a reception, the clink of cutlery, someone near the back laughing at something. I said clearly, not loud, I'd like to say something. Someone heard me and then someone else, and the room settled in the way that rooms do when they sense something is actually happening. I said, thank you, Robert. Modest circumstances. Yes, I raised Claire alone, on a nurse's salary, in Sudbury after her father died on a job site when she was 3 years old. A job site where a safety inspection was falsified by a subcontractor named Robert Haynes. I heard Susan make a sound. I kept going. I said, I'm not saying this to ruin a wedding. I'm saying this because my daughter is the most honest person I have ever known, and she deserves to know who is at this table. A complaint has been filed with the Ontario College of Trades. There is an ongoing investigation. The reference number is on file. Anyone who wants to know more is welcome to ask me directly. I put my water glass down. I sat. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Owen said loudly, Dad, you need to step outside. What happened after? The logistics of it, the way the evening reorganized itself around what I had said. I will not pretend it was clean. It was not clean. Susan was upset. There were relatives who left early. There was a conversation in a hallway between Owen and his father that I did not witness, but that lasted, I was told, 40 minutes. Claire came to find me 45 minutes after I sat down. I was outside on the dock by then, shoes off, feet above the water. The sky had gone the color of a peach. She sat down next to me, and for a while neither of us said anything. Then she said, How long have you known? I said, Since the engagement party in Oakville. She was quiet. I said, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't know how to tell you without making you choose. And I didn't want you to choose. I wanted you to have what you had with Owen because it's real and it's good, and it has nothing to do with what his father did. She said, I would have chosen you. I said, I know. She cried. I cried. A duck came very close to us on the water, completely indifferent to the whole situation, and we both laughed. The way you laugh when you've been crying and then something small and ridiculous intervenes and reminds you that the world is still ordinary. She said, What happens now? With the investigation? I said, I don't know. My lawyer says it could take years. It might not go the way we want, but there's a record now. There's a record that didn't exist before. She nodded. She took my hand. Owen came and found us about 20 minutes later. He stood at the edge of the dock and he said, I owe you an apology. I knew my father was. I knew he was not a good man in business. I didn't know the specifics. I should have asked. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He has steady eyes, that young man. The kind of eyes that don't look away from things. I said, You didn't do anything wrong. He said, I'm going to make sure he cooperates with the investigation. I believed him. The dance floor opened an hour later. Claire danced with Owen, and I sat at my table with her friends, and one of them, a woman named Bev, who had been Claire's roommate in second year, leaned over and said, That was the most Canadian mic drop I have ever witnessed in my life. And I laughed until my eyes watered. Robert Haynes was not at the venue at the end of the night. I don't know where he went. I don't spend time thinking about it. What I think about, on the mornings when I sit at my kitchen table and drink my tea and look out at the birch trees in the backyard, is Gerald. I think about what he would have thought of Claire. I think he would have been unbearably proud. I think he would have liked Owen. I think he would have made a terrible speech at the wedding, the kind that goes too long and circles back to itself and ends up being about a fishing trip somehow, and everyone would have loved it anyway. I think he would have wanted this. The investigation is still ongoing. In November, 3 months after the wedding, the regulatory board confirmed they were proceeding to a formal hearing. My lawyer says it is the first step. She says the process is what matters. She is right. The process is what matters, and the record, and the fact that I stood up in a powder blue dress in front of 240 people and said his name out loud at last. Claire is 3 months pregnant. She told me on a Sunday, on the phone, the same way she tells me everything. No preamble, just the fact, clear and clean, like she knows I can take it. I sat down right there in the kitchen. I said, "Is it a girl or a boy?" She said, "We're not finding out." I said, "Fair enough." She said, "Mom?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Thank you for not waiting any longer." I told her I was sorry it took as long as it did. I meant it. She said she understood. I believe she meant that too. We hung up and I went out to the backyard in my socks, which I know is a bad habit, and I stood in the cold October air and looked at the birch trees for a long time. They were almost bare. Just a few leaves left, yellow and stubborn, holding on past the point anyone expected. I thought, that's about right. I've been asked, since that September, whether I regret waiting so long, whether I should have said something the night I stood on that doorstep in Oakville and recognized the man who had taken Gerald from us. I've turned that question over 100 times, the way you turn a stone in your hand until you know every edge of it. What I've come to is this. I don't believe in accidents. Not in the way people mean when they say everything happens for a reason. I find that phrase a bit too tidy for the kind of life I've actually lived. But I do believe that what we do accumulates. Every choice stacks on top of the last one, and eventually the pile is tall enough that you can see something from up there that you couldn't see from the ground. Robert Haynes made choices. He signed off on inspections that didn't happen. He paid lawyers to make it disappear. He walked into rooms for 22 years with his chin up, comfortable in the knowledge that the woman he had harmed was bound by a document and too tired and too alone to fight back. Every one of those choices was a brick he laid himself. And I made choices too. I chose to sign that paper because I had a 3-year-old and 2 months of groceries. I chose to go back to work, to go back to school, to be at every one of Claire's school concerts, even when I'd come off a 12-hour night shift and could barely keep my eyes open. I chose for 11 months not to tell my daughter because I thought, rightly or wrongly, that she deserved to arrive at her own marriage without her mother's grief as a condition of entry. Those were my bricks. What I've learned, and what I want to say to anyone who has ever sat across a table from something unjust and felt utterly powerless, is that patience is not the same as surrender. I waited, but I did not stop. There is an enormous difference between those two things. Waiting without working is just hoping. Waiting while you quietly build a case, call a lawyer, read every document you can find, stay honest with yourself about what you know and what you don't. That is something else entirely. That is preparation wearing the face of patience. Claire forgave me for not telling her sooner. I don't take that lightly. Forgiveness is a thing people give you, not a thing you're owed. And she gave it freely. Sitting on that dock with her feet above the water and a duck floating by like nothing in the world was wrong. What she said to me, that she would have chosen me, I believe her. But I also know that I didn't make her prove it, and I'm glad for that. Loving someone sometimes means protecting their freedom to choose, even when you're terrified of what they might choose. Owen is going to be a good father. I see it in the way he held himself accountable that evening, the way he stood at the edge of the dock and said the words without being asked. Integrity isn't something you perform at the good moments. It's what you do when something ugly surfaces and you have to decide, in real time, who you are. Gerald would have liked him. The investigation is ongoing. I don't know how it ends. But I know that there is now a record with my name on it in an office in Toronto that says what happened and who was responsible. That exists regardless of what comes next. You cannot unhappen a truth once it has been spoken out loud in a room full of people. Claire is due in the spring. I've already started on a blanket. Cream and pale yellow, the same colors my mother used for Claire's 30 years ago. I don't know if it'll be a girl or a boy. Does it matter? I just know I'll be